Hello and welcome back to Champions of Security. I'm your host, Jacob Garrison, and today we are going to be talking about the common pitfalls of cloud security with two cloud experts, Michael Teo and Parveen Singh. Michael Teo is an Assistant Vice President and Principal Information Security Engineer at US Bank, where he's responsible for providing visionary guidance and enhancements for cloud and application security product offerings. He has over 10 years of experience as an information security professional. Michael specializes in designing and deploying cutting-edge security solutions to enhance cloud security posture, prevent cyber attacks, and mitigate risks to help organizations remain secure throughout their digital transformation. He's also a security evangelist and author, with his most recent feature being Collaborative Security to Defend the Modern Threat Landscape. We also have Parveen Singh, who is a cloud consultant specializing in Microsoft Azure services. He helps companies use the cloud effectively and efficiently while also keeping the security-first mindset and saving costs. He's worked with various organizations to help them migrate and secure their IT infrastructure, including government organizations, software development, retail, e-learning, and education sectors. He also runs a blog at parveensingh.com while helping IT enthusiasts find their next IT role and upskill to grow in the cloud field. Hey, Michael and Parveen, thank you so much for joining. I'm stoked to be talking to you both today.
Yep, thanks for having me.
Super excited to be here. Thanks, Jacob.
Of course. So let's just get into it. We're going to be talking about cloud security today. And I think a good place to start is to set people's expectations for what it's going to take for them to understand it. So in your experience, how long do you think people need to spend learning about or playing around in the cloud to really get a grasp on what cloud security is and what it's going to take on their part?
I can go first if, on that, it's kind of an ongoing process with security from my experience, from what I've seen in the industry and people doing is, very early on, you do try to learn some services and resources and end up, making a big hole, and then somebody exploits it, and then you kind of realize, okay, this is you gotta fix that thing. So it's kind of, from my side, it's kind of like an ongoing consistent learning, but usually people do start to get hold of the security aspects as they try to play around with more services and understand from really a wider perspective. Learning like 10 services in the cloud, you have a little knowledge of how it can break and how something can go wrong, versus you having like a more broader picture of 50 services. You kind of understand, okay, how this may fall into security loopholes.
Yeah, absolutely makes sense. And Michael, what about you? What do you think?
Yeah, no, I would agree with Parveen's statement. I think every organization or every individual maybe learns at different speeds and different rates, and maybe if you have a background with traditional sort of on-premise security concepts, then you're at like an advantage. But maybe if not, probably be better to take it services at a time. So maybe focusing on compute first, and then getting into storage or database and some of those sort of foundational aspects that are similar to on-prem, and then sort of just playing with the various security features and settings, and kind of like Parveen said, just digging a hole and sort of figuring out what you've sort of unveiled. But yeah, I think it kind of varies across different organizations. Some organizations are maybe born in the cloud, so they may be more aware of the various cloud security risks and what they're presented with. But for those organizations that are planning migrations, it may be more of a sort of learning curve if they're sort of newer to the cloud.
Yeah, the migrations aspect is a super important conversation, because to your point, people who are cloud native, they're born there, that's what they've always done. I don't know if it would feel more or less intuitive necessarily, but it certainly is more at the forefront of your brain. That's where you started, so you've always had to deal with it versus
I think from your question, Jacob, you mentioned like how long it takes for somebody. I think there's a difference between how long it takes and how early they should know. Maybe it takes somebody 6 months to realize they need to do security, but they should be doing it from ground zero whenever they start doing something like with the migration, right? As soon as you start doing migration, you got to consider all the security aspects at that time, instead of waiting 6 months doing all the migration and then kind of figuring out what to secure and what not to.
Yeah. And so if someone, let's dive into the migration thing. If somebody was trying to do a cloud migration and let's say they don't have someone on staff who is really confident in their knowledge of cloud security, how would you navigate that? Like, what would be the best steps to take to make sure that as you migrate to the cloud, you are keeping all of your customer data secure, you're keeping your business secure as you go through that process?
Yeah, there's always people out there. Being consultant myself, that's what kind of typically I see companies doing is they don't have any in-house resource. They just go out, find somebody who has done it before or who are in the market already doing it. What happens with that is, first of all, they don't have to hire somebody in-house and they get the expertise at relatively quicker versus having to interview somebody and going through the whole process of really finding somebody who can do it. And then third piece is the best practices. The person who is doing it for you as a consultant has probably done it like 50 times, and they kind of know all the bits and pieces of what could go wrong, how this may fail, or what, and they can actually give you some specific direction based on your organization. So I think having somebody outside your organization do it for you for a short-term project is a great way to go.
Okay, perfect. And I guess another thing that puts in my mind is, at what point does it make sense for them to hire someone? Like, let's say you have a consultant come in and help you with your migration. Would it make sense to bring someone on full time after that, in your opinion? Or do you need somebody there who is your dedicated cloud security resource? Or is that happen at a certain company size? Like, are there any thresholds for these things?
Yeah, Michael, you want to answer, or you want to?
Yeah, I would say that it's always beneficial to have internal parties focus on cloud security, because these people will be more privy to how you operate as a business, maybe have more insight into DevOps pipelines or where the critical infrastructure lives, and sort of have a better understanding of the business, and maybe can better describe and understand the lay of the land. I think with cloud security migrations, it's always beneficial to lean on the vendor for guidance. We mentioned cloud, and obviously the big three. They do a pretty good job at sort of implementing security into their product. Whether it's frameworks and regulatory guidelines and standards. A lot of that stuff can be built on top of your cloud sort of infrastructure. And so I'd always recommend that working really intimately with the CSP that you select, and really just taking it step by step when migrating assets to the cloud, and not trying to build Rome in one day. Just take a more phased approach, and really buckle down and understand one service at a time versus just trying to do it all at once, because that's what leads to some of those cloud security misconfigurations, or maybe you don't have necessarily the resources or the skills and expertise to move as fast as you want to. So I definitely recommend, just leaning on the vendor as much as you can to sort of implement that security during the migration.
Yeah, I can add on to that. So I think still having somebody in-house, depending on the size of the organization, if it's like too small, still premature in cloud, they're just trying to kind of migrate a few things and understand how it works. Definitely upskilling the current resources who are already handling the on-premises is definitely a way to go, and much easier path than hiring a consultant full-time all the time, for a year long-term, which is not feasible for some companies. But yeah, for bigger organization, they definitely have more bandwidth to maybe start hiring as soon as the project starts. But having consultants kind of lead that project, and full-time devs or engineers kind of doing the implementation or following along and understanding how whole things work, instead of actually administrating or controlling the aspects of which consultant can do better than somebody who is just kind of learning.
Yeah, you both brought up a bunch of things I'd love to dive into. And I think where I want to start is, Michael, you mentioned leaning on the vendors, and that these cloud security or the cloud service providers, like the big three, of course, being Amazon, Microsoft, Google, but anyone else who's running your cloud. You said leaning on them because they embed security into their products. And that brings up the whole point of the shared responsibility model, which most cloud CSPs are going to give you. Like, hey, we handle this part, you handle that part.
Yeah.
And I think that for some people who are learning, at least for me when I was starting in the cloud, it was a little bit confusing about, what specifically you as the end user needs to secure. So in your experience, where do people make mistakes when they're trying to hold up their end of the shared responsibility model? Like, what parts do you need to look out for and be really careful about?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and I'm glad to speak to it. I think you sort of brought it up, that common misconception is that you don't even have to worry about security at all, which is sort of very, very incorrect. I think a lot of people assume that because you can't necessarily physically see or touch your infrastructure, that whoever it is that's managing it is taking care of it, and that is true to an extent, right? So Amazon, Google, GCP, they're going to make sure that your hardware is secure, is running, the latest updates and patches, on your servers, and no one can physically break into the data center. It's secure from that level. But, depending on the level of resources or different types of services that you're using, there may be more responsibility that sort of falls on your plate. So, there's infrastructure as a service. So, you're talking about more so compute resources, virtual machines, containers, Lambda, all that type of stuff. Platform as a service where, you're getting into more like cloud functions. I misspoke, Lambda. And obviously there's the SaaS piece, which we're probably all sort of familiar with, but at each of those various levels and tiers, the security risk falls more on the end user. Maybe having to focus more on like, exposed storage buckets, are we responsible for sort of controlling those ACLs and those role-based access controls on specific resources or specific objects, making sure that you sort of understand who is responsible for what when it comes to, that sort of level of security. And, same thing with, platform as a service, same thing as software as a service. So I think, really just educating users, educating leadership, and sort of really understanding what is your cloud security, cloud service provider offering in terms of security for those various levels of cloud computing.
Yeah, Parveen, is there anything you want to add on to that?
Yeah, I think I'll step back a little bit on this idea of shared responsibility. How I see is it's kind of few different folds. One is like what could go wrong, where do people go wrong, and why does it happen? I think the why is also really important. That why do people do things wrong in cloud specifically? It's just because the mindset. They still have the like old on-premises mindset, like nothing will happen, nothing will break. In terms of some services like virtual machine, you leave the RDP port open and you assume, expect like nobody will be able to log in because they don't have the username and password. But the ports are open, right? So I think in that scenario, like, they don't understand the aspects of how it could lead into a bigger thing, having a public API running some, database queries, which you think it's, unless somebody have the URL, they won't be able to access. But, these days, everything is scrapable. Like people just scrape all the internet all the time. And, those things take seconds to get out in the hands of the people who are actually looking for those juicy information.
Yeah, that actually reminds me, one of my buddies, and I won't mention his name or his company's name, but when they were younger, they built a startup. I think they were like 20 at the time and didn't really know what they were doing. And they had a public URL they used for debugging that showed a bunch of performance data on their system and revealed a bunch of information that they were like, oh, well, no one knows this URL and they're not going to guess our login info, so they're not going to be able to see it. But like theoretically, if somebody figured it out, they would have access to so much information about the inner workings of their software. And to your point, people I don't know if they don't realize or they just accept the risk. Like, which one do you think it is? Do you think it's, or could it be both? Like, where does it fall on the ignorance to risk acceptance scale?
I think it's more of the ignorance at this point. Like, it's more of ignorance and risk acceptance, because they just don't know what else is there, right? If they're coming from on-premises with the mindset of, I'm doing this, it's not gonna help, it's not gonna do anything bad, that mindset is still the same, right? They'll just go work in the cloud with the same mindset. So I think it's just ignorance at this point. Acceptance could be, if they understand, okay, this dashboard doesn't give anything sensitive. It's just, a bunch of CPU metrics, which is not going to break anything. If somebody knows it, that could be a different scenario.
Yeah, that's a good point. And, everyone has sort of a different risk appetite. Maybe business A, they care about, their monitoring and observability logs being public. Some may not. So it kind of just depends, right? Every business has different rules and compliance and regulations that they have to abide by. Maybe a startup starting out very fresh, maybe they don't necessarily care about that at that time. But eventually, as they grow, they'll probably have to, start to buckle down on that type of thing.
Yeah. The early stage companies that get away with a little more leniency because they're not being regulated so strictly.
But when they need to stop too,
their endpoints are, and of course their endpoints are not so popular for somebody to exploit, right? They're still kind of in a pretty early stage.
Yeah. So you both brought up a lot of really interesting points, and we talk about cloud security misconfigurations. There's a lot of things that can go wrong, but one thing that I hear a lot, and Michael, I think you were the one who mentioned this, was access control lists or ACLs. We talk about certain IP addresses or certain users being able to access resources they shouldn't. So when you're coaching people through cloud security and you're trying to explain, hey, how do we establish which computer or which person should be able to access this particular resource? What are the considerations you take into mind? And do you have any ground rules that you would share for how people can establish an effective or a secure policy?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and definitely should be on the top of everyone's mind in the realm of security. But I'd say as like a fundamental ground rule is just, the principle of least privilege. It'll go such a long way in regards to anything access related. Just sort of understanding, what is the least amount of access that I need to be able to fulfill this duty or to, get whatever it is done. And I think a lot of this requires, doing research, having conversations with users, with networking folks, with subject matter experts, and really understanding, how should we be provisioning this access? How long should access be provisioned for? And then what is like the cleanup, once this access is no longer needed, how do we remove it so that we no longer have to worry about it? I think there's a lot of, push in the industry for sort of, zero trust architecture and sort of never trust, always verify sort of methodologies being implemented in security. But, at a fundamental level, all that it really needs is just least privilege. So I think, reviewing access permissions regularly, having some sort of identity access sort of governing team that is, reviewing access, granting access, revoking access, conducting access reviews. And I don't just necessarily mean like reviews of access that are related to identities like human users, but also like service accounts, also like firewall rules, also, network security groups, right? All of these sort of, present the aspect of giving access to a service or a resource or whatever it may be. But I think, just having people in place and technologies to be able to, grant that access, revoke that access, and then continuously review that access. So that way you're not out there sort of deploying anything that's overly permissive and that could sort of leave the floodgates open to a malicious actor.
Yeah, I love your point about not leaving the floodgates open. And is there a way to automate that process? You mentioned having a dedicated team that regularly reviews every access across your entire ecosystem. But how much of that can you automate? And this could be, in the specific big three cloud service providers, or it could be just in general outside of their services.
Yeah. So go ahead, Parveen.
Sorry. Yeah, I can answer that. Just a big on automation, actually. So I just kind of try to find automation in everywhere possible. With the access control list that Michael brought up, there are some services in Azure specifically, which I've seen companies using, like PIM, which I've seen some companies using it like really beautifully. It's like they have a master account, which doesn't give you any access, and you just can access your email accounts. And then they have another account, which can let you escalate your access. So you go in, request permission, which stays for like half an hour, 1 hour, 2 hours. And companies are like being creative in terms of like opening up the access for only like 2 hours. Let's say you want to do something in the privileged mode, just do it for 2 hours. Go back, request again if you need to. Otherwise, it goes back to zero, and that kind of leaves the door closed as you kind of forget. Maybe you're working on a VS Code, writing some code, and 2 hours later you start working on a different project and end up messing something in the previous one. That kind of possibility is reduced when you have that limited access, which kind of expires over time. And I think in terms of the other services which Michael mentioned, like resources and permission to those resources, there are some security policies we can always leverage in Azure, which can help us monitor what's happening if somebody's getting a higher permission or somebody's adding some permissions on the go. The security policies we can use. There's some activity logs we can always monitor using automation accounts.
I did not realize that you could have there was a service that allowed you to get access for only a couple hours. That's incredible.
Yeah. Azure PIM is really
it's really slick.
Sweet. And have you heard a lot of end users complain about it? Like, does it frustrate people, or is everyone pretty on board in your experience?
I've not seen any people complaining. It's just I think it's the companies have to set some policies if they want to secure the resources, right? Which end user comply with. If they want somebody to not have admin access from all the time, 24 hours, and they're only working like, let's say, on privilege mode for like 1 hour a day, they don't need like other 23 hours on privilege mode. So that also reduces a lot of risk of account hijacks and account access from somebody else, right? So I think people do understand why it is in place, as long as they are told that this is why it is. And of course, developers and senior people who are dealing with technology every day, they kind of understand why this thing is set in place. And somebody working in the office, not dealing much in technology, they probably don't even need that access. So they're less impacted by these changes.
Yeah, and I think too, it comes from the top down. You kind of have to, like Parveen mentioned, it had to kind of have to come down from leadership to create that sort of culture of security first. Security always kind of get like the bad rep of telling people, no, you can't access this, or you gotta get this approved. You kind of have to take the long road. But I think with tools like PIM, it sort of just allows you to sort of retrain your brain to say that, I don't really need this access indefinitely. I only really need it to perform this task, which would take 4 hours. And then I really don't need that access again. So I think it's a cultural thing. And, obviously there's going to be a lot of resistance to change initially. But I think as you start to sort of just preach, why, security is necessary, and sort of that it's everyone's responsibility, doing stuff like privilege, identity management. So it just becomes a part of a culture over time.
Yeah, I think that's got to ring true everywhere. Like, if your leadership is not taking it seriously, then other people aren't going to take it seriously as well. But if you can say, hey, we're implementing these controls to keep all of us safe, here's the procedure for you to be able to get through it, and you try to make it as painless as possible for people to behave in a secure manner, and you are encouraging and facilitating the behavior that you want to endorse. Yeah, that's amazing.
There's another feature in PIM which I really like is review management, which is like, a manager get a list of all the people who have requested access or who actually have active access to with the some form of owners or contributor, and then managers go in and approve those weekly, just in case somebody doesn't need that over a week, it automatically goes to deny, or automatically cancels the privilege. Unless manager kind of stay on top of it and make sure they review it every week and approve that, so that person doing it can have retain the access over time.
Yeah, and to the point you were talking about earlier, Michael, with the zero trust mentality and a least privilege mentality, right? Like, you operate in a way where you take away the permissions that aren't needed by default, and then you have to go in and allow them to your point, reduce the blast radius, reduce the impact, reduce the attack surfaces, and keep everything safer. And this, we talk about security. There's the whole CIA triad, And availability is one of the really major concerns with the cloud, right? It's a huge push or a huge reason when people go to the cloud. They don't have to have multiple data centers. They have automatic redundancy. I would love to hear from both of you. What do you recommend as a best practice in terms of how much redundancy you need or how you set up your cloud provisioning to make sure that these people aren't losing data or they aren't losing access to services they need or their customers can access their platform? Let's say like a data center goes down or an availability zone goes down. Like how do you encourage people to provision their cloud access?
Yeah, it's there's no concrete answer to this, and I guess it's not like a one size fits all. It definitely depends on what are you, I guess, required to do for obviously various reasons like compliance and regulatory reasons. But I would always recommend that you should employ some sort of, I guess, multi-regional architecture, especially if you have like critical services. You should be deploying those across multiple regions, so you're not sort of putting all your eggs into one basket. I would also recommend sort of, depending on what these critical services may be, sort of implementing maybe like some sort of load balancing, just in case, someone maybe tries to, DDoS your network or DDoS your application. Just have some sort of resiliency and load balancing features in your application would be beneficial. And I think just overall, again, stemming from leadership, having a disaster recovery plan, being able to prove and validate that you could, at a drop of a dime, back up your data to another region and still recover that in case of ransomware or, a DDoS attack. So, if I was to say three things in regards to like preventing outages and data resiliency and disaster recovery, I think multi-region is a must, at least for your critical resources and services. Anything that is like business critical should be in multiple regions. Leveraging load balancers or something that could help distribute traffic across various servers or resources. And then disaster recovery is something that's critical. I don't think people hit on this enough. Just having like tabletop exercises to walk through what happens if we get hit with ransomware, what happens if we get hit with a DDoS attack, what is our plan? Are we testing that plan? And are we, continuously ensuring that it works?
Yep. Parveen, do you want to add on anything?
I think I have a bit different take on this from what I've seen. Kind of, people talk about having disaster recovery and doing tabletop exercise, which Michael mentioned. But sometimes really have to set up the grounds to be able to do those things. Having some sort of configuration management in the place in case you need to recover quickly, because if you're doing everything manually from the portal, clicking through the browsers and deploying services, you cannot replicate those things. So having some sort of templating in the background using maybe ARM templates, Terraform, that can provision your resources like within a few seconds, relatively quicker than you're doing it manually through the portal. And I think it falls back even to the architecture diagram when the project even starts. Having a reference to which data sources needs to be available all the time, such as databases or cache, stuff like that, and some source resources which can be which can have different recovery point objective. If they can be recovered like 5 minutes later, there's no loss in that. Stuff like VMs which are not really hosting any data but just maybe applications or some web applications or some functions which don't really retain any sort of information but just running the API endpoints. So having some design which of course is multi-regional, but as well as some sort of services which are running on cold and warm, that can be turned on, actually turned on all the time, but still kind of running on a lower tier that save cost. That if it needs to be, they can be changed. Tiers can be changed. They can be they can have more CPU and power, and they just kind of take on the workload from the primary location.
Yeah. You brought up like the infrastructure as code concept and the whole idea of horizontal scaling, which is probably an entire podcast episode worth of material there.
Yeah.
In terms of those details. But yeah, just keeping that available and understanding. And to your point, you brought up price, Parveen, which we haven't talked about so far, but trying to understand, okay, how much do we need to provide for our customers to get a positive experience while also not overpaying and over provisioning the amount of resources that we're using for these tools. So it's definitely an intricate balance. And that's actually something I'd love to hear from you both. When you're dealing with cloud security concepts, how often do people ask you about the price of things? Like, is that something that falls into your responsibility when you're doing cloud security, or is there a certain person in an organization that has to, answer those questions more?
Yeah, I think the pricing question is really the first thing. Whenever a company decides to do a project, it's really the first concern, like how much it's going to cost. And usually you can put a cost on certain services, but there are some services you cannot put a number on, such as, storage accounts. It really depends on how much data you store and how much your velocity of your data is that you're pushing in and storing in for maybe different research. So yeah, pricing is definitely a concern. But, being an architecture, you do have visibility into all the aspects of how many users are going to be using this in terms of a rough idea. That gives you a ballpark of how much compute and how much resource you want to provision, so that at least the end user experience is good. But otherwise, there's always opportunity to turn on monitoring and keep an eye on how much resource is being utilized. And there are some things that these resources can do automatically, which is deprovision if it's not being used. So some of the services are like really intelligent and they deprovision. They don't do this queue, but they do deprovision the number of instances based on the consumption.
And so for deprovisioning, do you have to set that up how do you set that up? How do you set up automatic deprovisioning in a cloud platform?
I can give example of like Azure function, which is like a really typical function that people may run, running their APIs. With the APIs, you really don't know how many calls you're gonna get in a second. It could be like millions, it could be like hundreds. In that case, it doesn't make sense to keep that instance count to accommodate millions of requests all the time. During the night time or off time, you may need to deprovision. In that case, function gives you the capability to set a boundary of how many minimum resources you need and what's the maximum count you want to go up to. In that, it really counts how much request is coming in, and if it's able to solve the request in less number of instances, it will deprovision the rest of the services, and you just only paying for the amount of requests that are coming in.
Cool. So that
I need to add to that real quick. Actually, that's a good point too, because I've been at organizations where security teams would actually sort of present savings and cost reductions in the cloud as sort of like a metric. And teams would kind of brag about it. So I worked on a project where we were developing security standards for databases in the cloud. And so we ran these reports, we ran these sort of compliance checks and standards checks, and we got a list of, databases that came back, and we started reaching out to our resource owners. And we ended up finding out that a lot of these databases were either no longer needed, had already been migrated, and could be deprovisioned. And because of that deprovisioning, we were able to sort of save a lot of money. And then we basically just charted that savings over time. And, we presented it to leadership as sort of like a bragging moment. We were like, hey, due to our security research and sort of evaluation, we're able to identify, this number of resources and deprovision them, which led to, this amount of cost savings. So I think, cost is definitely something that, security does sort of hold close to home, because ultimately, the less money you're spending in the cloud, kind of the less risk is out there, if we kind of put it like that. So I think that's a good point that you bring up with costs.
There's another thing in cost right now in cloud, which is really popular, is reserved instances. So if you're sure that, you're going to use like 50 compute VMs every month, you can reserve 50 compute VMs. And that can be, utilized really intelligently. Like if say, out of those 50, you say every month I'm going to use 50, but in a month, maybe there's a week of overutilization and then 3 weeks of less utilization, it really adds up to 50. Then you're only paying for 50. Like there's no penalty for using more or less, because it's compute per hour. So based on how many hours you use, you're really like paying for efficiency as well, if you want to speed up the process in a day or two and then go back to normal. So reserved instances are like really shining right now because companies are trying to opt in for longer contracts, like 1 year, 3 year, and they almost saving like 50% of the cost.
Wow. Yeah. And that goes back to the point that, Michael, you had brought up earlier about security teams can have a reputation as being naysayers, and people don't always get along with their security team. But to your point, if you're doing your duties and helping the business save money, you're proving that like you're invested in the business's success, then it helps you build that positive relationship with all the other teams. And it helps you build that community of trust and instill the secure by default culture, which, yeah, it just goes full circle. One thing that we've sort of talked about, but haven't really dove into specifically is sensitive data in the cloud. We talked a lot about databases in the cloud, but are there ways for people to understand where their sensitive data lives, what data is sensitive? Like, what are the tools or the resources available for companies to know where they have the particularly sensitive assets living inside of their cloud ecosystem?
Yeah, I think there are a few different perspectives on this. If you talk about like, let's say just Microsoft specific, since, that's my expertise. In Microsoft 365 world, there are services that you can use which can classify data for you. If you have SharePoint files stored with some credit card information, with some date of births or stuff like that, those tools can scan those files and really tell you that this file is categorized as sensitive because it has this data. And it doesn't really stop there. It also blocks people from sharing the data further, which is end goal of securing the information is it doesn't leak, or it doesn't go further from where it is, in terms of sending by email or sending some shared links. That's part of the 365 world. If you go to Azure, of course, there are sensitive data in terms of the credentials. In that case, there's key vaults which people should leverage more often, just because they are cross-functional, they're cross-usable. You can have them anywhere. If you're running DevOps pipeline, you can use them there. If you're running code on your local computer as well, you can just use you can authenticate and use the key vault secrets and refer to them even from your desktop. So really don't really have need to have clear coded password in your local environment files anymore, because you have those capabilities which key vault provides you if you're a developer.
Awesome. Yeah, Michael, is there anything you want to add?
Yeah, no, I'd echo everything Parveen said. I think, especially now with, data being sort of everyone's sort of focus from a security and privacy perspective, DLP, data loss prevention, data loss protection is very essential to anyone, not just those in the cloud. But, specifically to the cloud, I think a good sort of first step is really just, like you said, data classification, labeling, and tagging. Having some sort of like standardized method of identifying where data is and sort of where it moves and how you can quantify it. I believe Azure has like Purview to sort of classify that sensitive data. And I think they have like built-on functionality within like Defender for Cloud where you can actually mask data that resides on database so only various users can see it. And then again, you can apply those sort of sensitivity labels and alert on it as needed. But I think, fundamentally, all those tools are out there. If, cost is a factor, you probably want to leverage some of the native stuff. I think GCP has Cloud DLP, where you're sort of able to mask data and hide any sort of sensitive data from end users, encryption at rest. So, Parveen mentioned security keys, rotating access keys. So yeah, I think, there's solutions out there. It's not easy. I think data governance is going to become very top of mind of all leaders in security, especially because, there's lots of fines out there that companies are getting slapped with for not treating their data the best or, unintentionally exposing it. So I can see a future where, a lot of these cloud providers sort of build more robust capabilities into their systems. But then even like third-party tools, I've seen, I think Wiz.io have a pretty robust data security posture management platform where they're sort of able to, track that data in motion within your environment. They can see, which VMs have access to which databases and what data resides on that database. So there's functionalities out there. It just, depends on, how skilled are you in leveraging those capabilities. And then, do you have, kind of circling back to leadership, do you have that support from leadership to then be able to sort of deploy a program that sort of governs data at your organization?
Yeah.
Yeah. One thing I'd say, what thing that really stops people from using all these tools, DLP, Purview, firewalls, is it's mostly the cost, because these things are expensive. Purview, we gotta store all the logs. Azure firewall is like super expensive. It's per hour, the cost is too much. And for small companies, they kind of don't see the value of deploying those expensive services. They just, they would rather go manual way of making sure everything is in place.
Yeah. And that kind of goes back to the conversation we had at the beginning of, there's a huge landscape out there of things you could learn and things you could use. And you learn along the way, but for some people that are in large enterprises, right, they have a wider selection of possible solutions. And to your point, people at smaller companies have probably a smaller list of things that are realistic for them just based on the value they're going to get compared to the price point, right? So as you go into a more and more complex environment, the sorts of things that could even be on your radar start to expand pretty dramatically, it sounds like.
Yep.
Cool. Well, we are starting to run low on time. I want to make sure you both have the opportunity to make a call to action. So is there anything that you want to promote to the audience? This could be anything at all. And Parveen, would you like to start?
Yeah, I can go first. I've been in cloud and security for a long time now. So most recently, what I've been trying to do is help students who are coming out of colleges, and even like the low-level IT professionals, like IT help desk professionals. I'm trying to help them get into cloud. Just because I've been teaching cloud for the last 2 years as part of my full-time career, like training, hands-on labs, building stuff. So I've been trying to teach students. Most recently, I've had a few students who are in Canada right now, kind of giving them a roadmap and helping them get to cloud. Because of course, the first role in the cloud is kind of a big jump from somebody who is doing on premises.
Amazing. So for any Canadians here, make sure you talk to Parveen if you want to learn about the cloud. And Michael, what about you?
Just to sort of close out, I would say just keep fighting the good fight. As security professionals, I say, we're all sort of in this together. We're all trying to sort of defend our organizations, defend our data, and protect, our precious resources. So, continue sharing educational resources, continue learning and continue networking, because we're all in this together.
Yeah, absolutely. So to everybody listening, make sure you're fighting the good fight. And if you're a Canadian fighting the good fight, feel free to give Parveen a call specifically. Awesome. Well, hey, Michael and Parveen, thank you so much for being here. This was an amazing time talking to you about.
Thanks for having us, Jacob.
Thanks, Jacob. Appreciate it.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Champions of Security. Be sure to come back next week. We're going to have another exciting guest on this very streaming platform. See you there.